Hi there. This lesson is part of a unit in this critical thinking class that's concerned with navigating complex social systems of knowledge production. This includes things like how science works, as in terms of scientific communities doing lots of different research, and then reporting out on that research. This has to do with expertise and how we rely on experts. This has to do with evaluating sources, especially academic sources, as we've seen in some other lessons. But this lesson has to do with the way that we socially navigate this problem of trying to get very current information. And in fact, how we deal with these scenarios where we have to sacrifice a little bit of verification in order to get currency. This lesson has to do with how we can responsibly use news media. So in a previous lesson on source evaluation, it was noted that among some other virtues, currency is a virtue for sources. That is to say, we prefer, all other things being equal, sources that are more current, that have more up-to-date information, over sources that have older information. But what counts as current enough for our purposes is contextual. I might be able to get by with a source that's, say, 10 years old if the topic that I'm investigating hasn't really changed that much in those 10 years. So part of how I figure out what's current enough involves trying to figure out how quickly the information in the context in question is changing. It's also worth noting that verification procedures take time. In our evaluating sources lesson, it was noted that for academic sources, the peer review that those articles undergo sometimes takes as long as a year or two. And sometimes we can't wait a year or two. We want to know what's happening right now. And that means we're going to have to sacrifice some of those verification procedures. We're going to have to verify on the fly after publication. And this brings us into territory that involves the evaluation of sources, but rather than academic sources that go through this lengthy peer review process, we're going to be looking at news media sources and raising this question, can I trust the news media? Now that question all by itself is maybe too broad to be a useful question. It's worth noting that news is, as we were just pointing out, new. This is the whole point of news media, is that it gives us up-to-date, super current information. And that means that I'm privileging currency over verification when I'm talking about news media. So I need to trust appropriately. I can't, trust blindly. I have to kind of recognize that I need to temper my trust when I'm thinking about news media, if only for the reason that we're getting the first draft. Furthermore, this notion of the news media as if we could paint something so large and varied with a broad brush is a little bit silly. The media is a very big and diverse group, and some of them are trustworthy for some things, and some of them are trustworthy for other things. And when I ask a question like, can I trust the news media? I need to figure out, well, wait, hold on, trust for what? I don't trust the news media to perform an appendectomy on me, but maybe I trust certain news media to give me certain information on certain topics. Beware of hasty generalizations when we're evaluating things like the news media. And, be skeptical of folks who will attempt to paint the entirety of news media with one large, broad brush. Now, with those two stipulations in mind, I think we can look at a variety of questions that we can ask ourselves when we're looking at a particular piece of news media and trying to figure out, well, is this trustworthy for certain purposes? For starters, we should be looking for labels when we're consuming news media. Try to be aware of what news neighborhood you're in. Are we looking at something that's supposed to be or purporting itself to be straight investigative reporting? Am I reading something that's an opinion piece? Is this a press release from some corporation? Is it an advertisement? All of these are parts of news media, and I need to figure out what kind of media I'm looking at before I can start to begin to wonder whether or not I can trust it for certain things. Some of the most helpful labels that we can find involve labeling opinion pieces. This is a practice that is relatively popular and common in print media. And in fact, in many news organizations, there's a pretty hard firewall, not just within the publication between the straight investigative reporting, between the news and the opinion section, but also within the organization, the people who produce the news and the people who produce the opinion. These people are kept separate. Ideally, this is the sort of practice that is sadly becoming less and less common, but you can still find it. And we should probably regard those organizations that try to maintain some sort of hard boundaries between different kinds of news media neighborhoods within their own publications. And it's a whole lot more helpful when they label it for us as a consumer. There's a whole spectrum of reliability depending on the kind of reporting that's being done. On one end, we can talk about very, very cautious inferences. And cautious inferences are going to be reliable, but they're going to be cautious. We're not going to be able to make as many of them because our standard of reliability is so high. On this side, we'll find what is sometimes referred to as straight investigative reporting, a kind of a just the facts approach to reporting. And what we'll find here is that there's not as much that can be said in this reporting because the inferences that it's making are so cautious, because the sources that it's relying upon are very, very reliable sources. Probably the most important feature of the stuff that we'll find at this far end of cautious and super reliable types of news media are news media where we're not really making too many inferences. We're seeing our reporters give us a whole bunch of information that could be used in premises for other arguments, but there doesn't really seem to be any suggestion of how to contextualize the information that's being presented in the article within some kind of argument to kind of give some sense of what kinds of conclusions might we be able to come to from this information. We do start to see some of these inferences being made in a slightly distinct neighborhood that sometimes, and I would say whenever you see it labeled as such, you should probably recognize that the producer of this piece of news media is trying to help you by labeling what kind of news media product this is. But sometimes we'll talk about news analysis, which is like a halfway point between straight investigative reporting and opinion pieces. In news analysis, what we'll start to see is some inferences being made, but those inferences are relying almost exclusively on straight investigative reporting. So in news analysis, we get some sense, usually from some sort of expert, about how to make sense of all of the decontextualized information that I might get in straight investigative reporting. And preferably in those news analyses, we'll get some sense that the author doesn't really have any particular axe to grind. They don't have a dog in the fight. When they do have a dog in the fight, we're getting into a slightly different territory, a slightly different neighborhood, the neighborhood of opinions or opinion pieces or editorials or very good blogs. Not all blogs. Some blogs might end up on this side of reckless inferences, and we can see we're getting away from more and more cautious inferences. But that doesn't mean that this information isn't reliable. It doesn't mean that it's not useful. It's very, very useful. For my part, I find it very useful to know what sorts of arguments, what sorts of thought processes people who have opinions on these matters are coming to. I want to hear the opinionated pieces from folks who know what they're talking about. And this becomes like a very, very useful sort of news media product. I just have to recognize that it's a little bit further away from the cautious inferences that I can make in straight investigative reporting. It's a little bit farther away from what I might think of as neutral news analysis. It's useful, but it's useful in a way that is a little bit less reliable, a little bit less trustworthy. At the far end of this spectrum of reliability, at the far end of reckless inferences, we have stuff that is, I would say, is maybe of questionable utility. Sometimes it's irresponsible. We kind of might note that that I've described the inferences made in these kinds of news media products as reckless. I had a journalism professor who referred to this as bloviation. Sometimes we might refer to this as propaganda. And again, it's not all useless, it's not all bad, it's just not very reliable, and that needs to be taken into account when we use it. And again, I'll stress that clear labeling is a really good sign from a news organization that they are aware of these new news neighborhoods and they are not blurring the lines between them, and they're trying to ensure that you, as the consumer, are not blurring the lines between these news neighborhoods. Clear labeling is a good sign that the news organization that you're getting your information from is trying to help you use their product responsibly. So in addition to looking for labels, another thing that usually pops up when people talk about how trustworthy or how reliable news media is this question of fairness and balance. This question of whether or not the relevant perspectives are getting the appropriate amount of time or space or emphasis in the news media product. And while these are important concepts, I would say they're frequently used in a kind of a sloppy and irresponsible way. So one of the things that I'm going to look to do here is to clean up these concepts of balance, fairness, and bias. Let's start with balance, which is I sometimes kind of refer to as the Fisher-Price my first version of a fairness concept. Balance is pretty much this idea that everything is being treated equally. All of the sides of some particular issue are going to get equal time, equal weight, and equal tone in a balanced news media article. Sometimes balance is appropriate, in particular when we're talking about a story where we're not really sure what the various sides of this issue are just yet. We haven't really had a chance to do any verification. If we do have a genuinely new news story, then giving equal time, equal weight, and equal tone to all of the relevant positions seems like it might be appropriate. That said, we refer to this as a clumsy first stab at fairness because it's not always appropriate to be balanced. Equal time, equal weight, and equal tone isn't always fair. For example, I don't want to have to represent the positions of Holocaust deniers every time I write an article that mentions the Holocaust. That isn't particularly fair, even though it would involve giving equal time, equal weight, and equal tone to two competing views on an issue. It wouldn't be fair because it's not appropriate to give Holocaust deniers equal time and equal weight and equal tone to those who recognize the very well-established historical facts regarding the Holocaust. The Nazis themselves kept impeccable records on what was going on. Fairness isn't exactly the same thing as balance. It's not everybody being treated the same. Fairness is everybody being treated appropriately. And this is an idea that I would say every small child will eventually discover when they try to say that it's not fair, that, for example, they have to go to bed earlier than the grown-ups, and the grown-ups get to stay up and watch grown-up TV and have grown-up fun. And they'll say, well, I don't get to do what the grown-ups get to do, and that's not fair. And their mistake there is that it's totally fair. It's entirely appropriate for a small child to have an earlier bedtime than an adult. This has to do with actual differences between children and adults and the kind of sleep schedules that they need to keep in order to take care of their bodies, and also the kind of the appropriateness of certain sorts of television or recreational activities. And the same goes in news media as well. Non-serious positions that don't have good justificatory support don't deserve equal time, equal weight, and equal tone as serious positions. We want to be aware of what's sometimes referred to as false equivalency. It's not fair coverage to treat both sides the same if they are not actually the same with regard to the kind of reasons and justificatory support that they have. That's not fair, that's just balanced. Sometimes being fair requires that we be unbalanced, and sometimes being balanced is unfair. And we want to be careful with that idea because it's very easy for us, I think, to kind of slide into a biased view of things that we justify to ourselves by saying that no, it's only fair that the side that I believe in gets a kind of a more sympathetic treatment than the side that I disagree with. This is the sort of thing that in order to maintain true fairness, I can't simplify it to balance, but I also want to make sure that I don't have a distorted version of fairness that's been distorted through bias. Now, we mentioned bias before when we were talking about cognitive biases, and there we tried to draw our attention to the fact that everybody's got biases. In fact, it's a very common and dangerous bias to suspect that I'm more rational than other folks, that other people are more prone to bias than I am. Bias is nothing more than a psychological predisposition to judge in a certain way, and we need these biases in order to get by in our everyday lives. We can't afford to slow think our way through all of our choices. We have to fast think our way through heuristics and biases. So it's not always bad to have these biases, but sometimes this can lead us to judge unfairly in a certain direction. And oftentimes we see this accusation of bias hurled at a news media outlet. And I think this is a really kind of a lazy and an irresponsible way to use this concept. And we can start by recognizing that to even establish bias in a news media outlet credibly, I need to actually demonstrate a generalizable track record of judging in a particular way. And that is the sort of thing that, as we kind of saw in our lesson on making enumerative inductive generalizations, that's the sort of thing that, if done responsibly, involves the collection of a lot of data and data analysis. A casual perusal of a couple of articles that take an extreme position is not going to be enough to credibly demonstrate that a news media outlet is biased. So that accusation of bias, I think, it's hurled about really casually, and I think in a way that doesn't necessarily help us. In particular, because each of us has biases too, and we really need to be aware of the very strong possibility that our perceptions of the biases of various news media outlets is the sort of thing that could in fact be biased. That my biases might color the way that I think of the biases of other news media outlets. If they're consistently reporting on things that I disagree with, I have a tendency to think of them as biased and myself as correct, when there's a distinct possibility that it could be the other way around, or possibly that we're both biased in opposite directions. And none of those things entitle me to be able to reject a piece of news media on site just because I have some sense that, like, oh, that came from a biased source. At most, suspected bias is cause for heightened scrutiny. I maybe have some sort of sense that I should be very, very careful with articles that come from news media sources that I suspect to be biased. But that's not the same as saying that I have license to dismiss a piece of reporting out of hand just because it comes from what I consider to be a biased source. This is a version of an ad hominem argument. It's entirely possible that even biased sources can sometimes produce reliable reporting. And while the availability of information on the internet has kind of given us the prospect of being able to get information from lots of different sources, the reality of how we manage our social media networks is that it's very, very easy to get caught in a bubble, to get caught in a social media network where we only hear reporting from certain kinds of sources, and we ourselves begin to accumulate a biased view of what the world is like. You shouldn't reject biased sources. You should try to get as many different biases as possible in your news media diet. You need to diversify your news media diet. Don't allow yourself to get caught in a bubble. This is the easiest way to develop a bias of your own that then makes it a whole lot more difficult to responsibly use news media. Having established that the perception of bias is the sort of thing that could itself be biased, we can maybe then start to look at the actual reporting in the actual piece of news media that we're looking at and try to decide, are there some cues in this reporting that tell me that perhaps the author had some sort of bias or exhibiting some bias? So for example, we might want to try to notice if there's biased language, if there's word choice that kind of unnecessarily casts the issue that's being described in a certain light, in a negative or a positive light, when we didn't necessarily need to use that kind of biased language, where it was possible to give a more neutral reporting of what was going on. We want to make sure that the headline matches the article. This is actually an increasingly common form of sloppy and biased reporting that tries to prey on the way that a lot of folks don't really get past the headline when they're perusing news. They're maybe just going through their social media feed and they're seeing headlines and maybe one sentence of a story, and that's as far as they go. They don't actually click and read the rest of the article. And in that kind of a scenario, you might have a headline that gives one impression, but the rest of the reporting doesn't exactly support what that headline says. So, for starters, if you're trying to evaluate how trustworthy a piece of reporting is, get past the headline, read the whole article, and then ask yourself, wait, does the article actually support the headline? Do they match one another? When they don't, we might want to be careful that we haven't been kind of set up for some sort of anchoring bias, that we read the headline first, and that gives us a particular way of thinking about like what the article is going to tell me. And once I've got that lens stuck in my head, I'm going to read all of the rest of the article through this lens of, oh, it's supposed to support the headline. And if I'm not careful, if I'm not critical, if I'm not reflective about that, if I'm not actually stopping to ask myself, wait a minute, does the article actually match the headline? Then I might get kind of hoodwinked into believing that an article supports claims that it doesn't actually support all that well. I also want to make sure that I'm paying attention to not just what is in the article, but what's not in the article as well. What's missing? What isn't being said? If an article is about a person or about some organization, did that organization get an opportunity to give their side of the story in this article? If they haven't been given the opportunity to give their side of the story, is that a problem? Why isn't that being said? Why is this absent from the article? If there's certain information that I think would be useful in trying to take the information that's given in this article and come to some sort of actionable inference from it, some actionable conclusion, well, why isn't that information there? Where can I get it if it's not here? This all starts to go towards a notion in journalism that's usually referred to as transparency. And transparency is broadly this idea that the author is letting you know how they know what they know. And they're also, I would say, when we're really getting into some serious versions of transparency, we're not only explaining how we know what we know, but we're also telling our audience why we don't know what we don't know. What's being left out? What are the things that, like, I don't know but wish that I did? And why wasn't I able to get that information for this particular article? Perhaps the reporter reached out to the subject of the article, but the subject of the article didn't respond to their reaching out to get a comment. In which case, the reporter should say so, and frequently they do. They'll say, we reached out to this party for comment, but they declined to comment at the time of publication. This represents a sort of accountability to an ongoing process to discover the truth. And oftentimes, a big part of that accountability and transparency involves a news media recognizing when it gets something wrong. When a news media gets something wrong, it should offer a retraction and explain why it is that it got it wrong, and ideally, how it is that they're going to avoid getting that sort of thing wrong in the future. News media that does this, that identifies what is not known, draws your attention to it, and explains why that's not known yet, this is a very good sign that news media is, as we were saying before, the news media that uses labels, the news media that goes out of the way to be transparent and explains how they know what they know and why they don't know what they don't know. This is a news media outlet that is doing its best to help you use its product responsibly. One of the most contentious issues that comes up in this discussion of transparency involves the use of anonymous sources. So sometimes a news media outlet will use a source that is anonymous. They will tell you that they got the information from this source, but they won't tell you the name or the identity of this source. And this is a practice that is very easy to criticize. When we don't know the identity of the source, it's hard for us to evaluate the reliability of the information that's coming from that source. That said, sometimes news media outlets have to rely upon anonymous sources because that's the only way for them to get the information. The information is being volunteered by somebody, but that person doesn't want their identity to be known because they, for example, might fear retribution from sharing this information. And if we can't respect and protect the anonymity of that source, it means that certain information just gets kept secret and isn't available to us. And sometimes we need to know that information, even though powerful people don't want us to have it. We see here the policy on use of anonymous sources by the Associated Press. Any reliable news media outlet, by the way, is going to have a homepage with an about portion to that homepage that tells you their policies for how they produce the news. The Associated Press is a particularly reliable news media outlet, and one of the reasons why they're reliable is that they have very strict principles and policies on the use of anonymous sources. We see here that they only use anonymous sources when the material that's being offered is just information. It's not somebody's opinion. So the AP doesn't use anonymous sources when all that anonymous source is offering is their opinion on some matter. They have to have access to some objective material information. Beyond that, this information can only be accessible through the use of this anonymous source. The AP will do their best to try to find this information from a non-anonymous source before they'll run a story that uses an anonymous source. And last but not least, that source, even though they're unnamed and anonymous to the audience, that source is known by the author of the piece, and the AP requires that that source's identity be known to an editorial manager of the Associated Press as well. So not just the author, they have to run it to up the chain to their boss, and they have to reveal the identity of that source to their boss, and that source has to be regarded as reliable, as somebody who's in a position to have direct knowledge of the information that they're presenting. So even though their identity is withheld in the reporting, somebody in the news media organization knows who they are and knows whether or not they're the sort of person that is trustworthy. And as the audience of the news media outlet, we have to trust the news media outlet that the person that they're citing as an anonymous source is, in fact, somebody who's in a position to know that there's somebody who is reliable. Now, obviously, that puts us in a kind of a dicey situation where we're trusting this news media outlet, and if possible, we'd like to not have to just rely upon their goodwill and their trustworthiness. And so transparent news media outlets, like the Associated Press, will often, in addition to telling us that they got this information from an anonymous source, they'll do what is known as characterize the source. They'll say something like a high-ranking official said this. So they'll tell us what sort of position this person is in, such that they're in a position to know the information. And they'll try to do that in a way that doesn't reveal their identity. And this is a really difficult balancing act for any news media outlet to try to walk. And it's the sort of thing that any responsible news media consumer needs to keep in mind when evaluating the news media that they're consuming. Sometimes we want to get information from anonymous sources, and we should understand that that's a little bit of a risky process, and as long as we temper our trust in that information appropriately, there is nothing wrong with taking information from those sorts of sources. Similarly, there's nothing wrong with a piece of news media giving us some context, some background information that not only provides us with this kind of raw, just the facts reporting, but frames that raw information as meaningful. We get less of this context in what's known as straight investigative reporting. We get a little bit more of that context in news analysis, and a little bit more of that context with a little bit of kind of introduction of possible bias and people who have an axe to grind as we drift into opinion media. But all of that is trying to provide us with some context that helps us understand why this information is useful, how it is that we make this information meaningful. The notion that there is such a thing as meaningful but contextless information seems to be a little bit of a myth. In order to make something meaningful, we need to contextualize it. And sometimes it's helpful to have that context produced within the article. Sometimes it's nice to know that we don't have the context within this article, but perhaps we need to provide the context ourselves by referencing other bits of news media. And this is probably one of the biggest takeaways in trying to think about how to responsibly use news media such that you can trust it appropriately. And that's the recognition that journalism is a process. It's the first draft of history. To get a sense of what's going on, in order to get context and in order to figure out how reliable this information remains as new information comes to light, we need to follow a story over time. One single article is hardly ever enough to come to an actionable decision. This is true of academic writing, this is true of scientific studies, and this is true of journalism as well. Every piece of information is meaningful insofar as it has context amongst other bits of information, and every journalistic article is helpful and meaningful and useful insofar as it exists within a context of other information being provided by other news media outlets. The news media is our social system of coming up with the most current available knowledge, not necessarily the most reliable, because it hasn't necessarily been subject to a whole lot of verification just yet. But this is the way that we, as a group of knowers and a discursive community, are able to come up with the best available, most current information. It's important to maintain an active comportment towards your news media consumption, rather than a passive comportment. This maybe brings us back to that idea of System 1 and System 2 thinking that we talked about earlier, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Our System 1 thinking is passive. It's a relatively low-effort way of thinking. And our System 2 thinking is active. It's a relatively high-effort, conscious, and critically reflective form of thinking. And we know that we're far more likely to be able to engage our critical faculties when we're already in System 2 thinking. That is to say, when I'm actively looking for information rather than just passively absorbing media. There's an increasingly common news media consumption habit in our culture that involves the use of 24-hour cable news programs that are just left on in the background all the time. They're in the waiting room of your doctor's office. They're at the pump when you're getting gasoline for your car. Sometimes people keep them on all day long in their house. And the fact that we are passively absorbing media in those sorts of circumstances already sets us up to be uncritical, to be consuming and synthesizing that information according to System 1 thought rather than System 2 thought. Leaving aside how psychologically healthy it might be to have the news on in the background 24 hours a day, it's probably worth noting that critical news consumers don't simply pick a best source and rely on it. I'm not here to say that like Fox News or CNN or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or The Economist or NPR or the Associated Press or any of these are like, this is a reliable source, that this is where you should get your information from. You shouldn't be getting your information from any one particular source. And you shouldn't be getting your information in a passive sort of way, where you pick the source one day and then you just kind of sit back and get all the information from that source after you've picked it. A critical news consumer comes to news media with a question. They have something that they're trying to figure out. They figure out what questions they have, and they go out looking for the best available sources. If you approach news media from this active comportment rather than a passive comportment, you're setting yourself up to be more critically reflective, more able to use the kinds of tools that we've developed in this class, which are the sorts of tools that you can only access once you've moved from System 1 into System 2 thought. Now, it's inevitable that on some level you're only going to be able to become aware of certain questions, certain issues that you might be interested in a passive sort of way. And it is important to think about, like, what are those sources? Like, how do you kind of expose yourself passively to sources of information that even kind of alert your attention to the fact that something is perhaps worth thinking about? That's unavoidable. But once you have kind of identified something that you're interested in, something that you care about, you have a unique opportunity there. Start trying to think about the way that you use news media, not in terms of which sorts of sources you choose and rely on, but more in terms of what kinds of questions you have. And once you have some clear question in mind, you can go out looking for sources through this active comportment so that you're prepared to be a critical news consumer. I hope this lesson has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in another one.